In the spring of 1943, a German intelligence officer in Berlin received a report that seemed so preposterous, so utterly divorced from reality, that he filed it away as obvious Allied propaganda not worth passing up the chain of command. The report claimed that the Ford Motor Company had constructed an enormous factory on farmland outside Detroit, a facility so large it covered over 3 million square feet under a single roof. According to the report, this factory was producing B-24 Liberator heavy bombers at an impossible rate, allegedly completing a new 4-engine bomber every hour or so. The intelligence officer had seen plenty of exaggerated claims and misinformation before. This one was particularly absurd. Building a heavy bomber was a complex undertaking, requiring thousands of skilled workers, precision assembly of over 1 million parts, and careful quality control. The idea that Ford could be churning them out like automobiles was laughable. He marked the report as unreliable Allied disinformation and moved on to more credible intelligence matters. That German officer's dismissal of the Willow Run report would prove to be one of the most consequential intelligence failures of the war. Because everything in that report was true. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant was not only real, it was accomplishing something that had never been done before in human history. Ford was applying the assembly line principles he had pioneered for automobile production to building heavy bombers, and the results were staggering. At peak production in 1944, Willow Run was completing one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Not every day. Not every shift. Every single hour. The plant operated around the clock with multiple shifts, and bombers rolled off the line in an endless stream that seemed to violate every known principle of aircraft manufacturing. The Germans would learn the truth eventually, when those Willow Run bombers filled the skies over Germany and rained destruction on German cities. But by then it was far too late to do anything except surrender. To understand how revolutionary Willow Run was, you need to understand how aircraft were traditionally built in the early 1940s. Aircraft manufacturing was essentially a craft industry. Skilled workers assembled each plane individually in large hangars, carefully fitting components together, making adjustments as needed, solving problems as they arose. Each aircraft was unique in small ways, with parts that might not quite fit perfectly, requiring skilled hands to make them work. Building a heavy bomber like the B-24, with its 4 engines, complex systems, and over 1 million individual parts, typically took several thousand man-hours spread across many weeks or months. Aircraft factories employed master craftsmen who had trained for years. The work required precision, patience, and expertise. It was quality work, but it was slow work, and there was no easy way to speed it up without sacrificing quality or overwhelming your limited supply of skilled workers. Henry Ford looked at this traditional approach and saw inefficiency. He had revolutionized automobile manufacturing 30 years earlier by breaking down complex assembly into simple, repetitive tasks that could be performed by workers with minimal training. Each worker did one specific job, did it over and over, became expert at that one task. Components moved down an assembly line, with each station adding something until a complete automobile emerged at the end. The system was brilliant in its efficiency. Ford had produced millions of Model T automobiles using these methods, making cars affordable for ordinary Americans and transforming the nation in the process. In 1940, when the government was desperate to increase bomber production, Ford proposed applying the same principles to building B-24 Liberators. Aircraft industry experts were skeptical. Airplanes weren't cars, they said. Aircraft manufacturing required craftsmanship and individual attention. You couldn't just mass-produce bombers on an assembly line. Ford disagreed. He believed any manufacturing process could be systematized, broken down into component steps, and organized for maximum efficiency. The government, desperate for bombers and willing to try anything that might work, gave Ford a contract and essentially unlimited resources to prove his theory. What happened next was one of the great industrial achievements of the 20th century. Ford didn't just build a factory. He built the largest manufacturing facility ever constructed under a single roof. The Willow Run plant, constructed on farmland in Ypsilanti Township, Michigan, covered 3.5 million square feet. That's 67 acres under one roof. The main assembly building was 1/4 mile wide and 3/4 of a mile long. When workers entered at one end, They literally couldn't see the other end because it was beyond the horizon of the factory floor. The building was so large it had its own weather patterns inside, with fog sometimes forming near the ceiling on humid days. Construction of Willow Run began in April 1941, months before Pearl Harbor. The site had been farmland, flat and empty. Within a year, it had been transformed into the world's most advanced manufacturing facility. The speed of construction itself was remarkable. Foundations were poured, steel framework erected, walls and roof installed, machinery moved in and installed, all while design work was still being completed on the production system itself. Ford threw resources at the project with an urgency that reflected his understanding that war was coming, whether America was ready or not. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, Willow Run was already taking shape. The first B-24 rolled out in September 1942, less than 18 months after ground was broken. It wasn't pretty and it had problems, but it flew. Ford's engineers had proven the concept was possible. Now they just had to make it work efficiently. The assembly line that Ford designed for Willow Run was unlike anything that had existed before. It stretched for over a mile through the factory, with the B-24 fuselage moving slowly along rails while workers at hundreds of stations installed components, connected systems, and checked their work. The beauty of the system was that it broke down the enormously complex task of building a bomber into thousands of simple jobs. A worker didn't need to understand the entire aircraft. They needed to know how to install one specific component, or connect one particular set of wires, or rivet one section of aluminum skin. They did that same task dozens of times per shift, every shift, until they could do it perfectly in their sleep. Quality control inspectors checked work at multiple points along the line, catching problems before they propagated through the system. The whole operation was choreographed like a ballet, with components and sub-assemblies arriving at exactly the right moment from feeder lines where they had been prepared. The workforce that made Willow Run function was as revolutionary as the factory itself. Ford needed over 40,000 workers to run the plant at full capacity. There was no way to find 40,000 skilled aircraft workers in Michigan or anywhere else. So Ford hired whoever was available and trained them to do specific jobs. Many were women, housewives and mothers who had never worked in a factory before, but who learned to rivet, wire and assemble aircraft components. Some were older men beyond draft age. Others were people with disabilities that kept them out of military service but didn't prevent them from working in a factory. The demographics of Willow Run's workforce reflected America itself. Diverse, determined, and willing to do whatever was necessary to win the war. These weren't master craftsmen. They were ordinary Americans who learned specific skills and performed them with dedication and growing expertise. Training programs at Willow Run were designed for speed and efficiency. New workers might receive a few days of training on their specific task, then be put on the line under supervision until they demonstrated proficiency. The jobs were designed to be learnable quickly. You didn't need years of apprenticeship to install a particular component if the component was designed to be installed easily and the process was clearly documented. Ford's engineers had thought through every aspect of production, eliminating unnecessary complexity wherever possible, standardizing everything that could be standardized, documenting procedures so clearly that mistakes became difficult. The result was that ordinary people with minimal training could build bombers that met military specifications and performed reliably in combat. The initial production rate at Willow Run was slow. The first bomber took months to complete as workers learned their jobs and engineers worked out problems with the production system. But Ford had always understood that learning curves were steep when you were doing something new. The second bomber took less time than the first. The 10th took less time than the second. By early 1943, Willow Run was producing several bombers per day. By mid-1943, production was up to dozens per week. And by 1944, the factory hit its peak production rate. One B-24 Liberator completed every 63 minutes. The assembly line was moving constantly, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers in 3 shifts kept the line running around the clock. Every hour and 3 minutes, a new bomber rolled out the end of the line, was towed to a flight testing area, checked over by flight crews, and then flown away to join the war effort. The statistics from Willow Run are almost hard to believe, even when you know they're true. At peak production, the factory was consuming 18,000 tons of steel per month, over 1 million square feet of aluminum sheet per month. Enough electrical wiring each month to stretch from Detroit to San Francisco. The logistics of keeping the factory supplied were as challenging as the manufacturing itself. Trains arrived constantly with raw materials and components. Trucks delivered parts from hundreds of suppliers across the Midwest. The factory had its own power plant because the local electrical grid couldn't handle the load. It had its own water treatment facility, its own fire department, its own medical clinic staffed around the clock because with 40,000 workers, medical emergencies were a daily occurrence. Willow Run was essentially a small city dedicated to one purpose: building bombers faster than anyone had imagined possible. German intelligence continued to receive reports about Willow Run throughout 1943 and into 1944. Neutral observers, including Swedish and Swiss journalists, visited the plant and wrote articles about what they had seen. Allied propaganda broadcasts mentioned Willow Run's production achievements. Intercepted communications referenced the plant. But German analysts remained skeptical. They had their own aircraft factories. They understood how difficult bomber production was. Their own efforts to produce heavy bombers had been limited because the complexity and cost were so prohibitive. The idea that Americans had solved these problems through what amounted to automobile assembly line techniques seemed to contradict everything German engineers knew about aircraft manufacturing. So they continued to assume the reports were exaggerated, propaganda designed to impress neutrals and demoralize Germany. The truth became undeniable when B-24s began appearing over Germany in massive numbers. The 8th Air Force, conducting daylight bombing raids from bases in England, was flying missions with hundreds of bombers. The 15th Air Force, operating from Italy, was doing the same. B-24s were everywhere, and their numbers kept growing. German fighter pilots who shot down B-24s noticed that the bombers kept coming in even greater numbers the next week. German intelligence officers counting American bomber strength found their estimates constantly being revised upward. Where were all these aircraft coming from? The numbers didn't make sense based on German understanding of aircraft production capacity. Even if America had dozens of aircraft factories, all working at maximum capacity, they shouldn't be able to produce bombers at the rate German observers were documenting. The answer, though German intelligence was slow to accept it, was Willow Run. That single factory, the one German analysts had dismissed as propaganda, was producing more B-24s than all of Germany's bomber factories combined. By the end of 1944, Willow Run had built over 6,000 B-24 Liberators. The total production from the plant by war's end would be 8,085 bombers. Other factories were also building B-24s under license from Consolidated Aircraft, the original designer, but Willow Run alone accounted for nearly half of all B-24 production. The plant had demonstrated that Ford's vision was not only possible, but superior to traditional aircraft manufacturing methods for producing large quantities of a standardized design. For the German people enduring Allied bombing raids, the source of the bombers overhead didn't matter as much as the destruction they brought. B-24s from Willow Run participated in raids on Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, and countless other German cities. They bombed oil refineries, cutting off fuel supplies that German forces desperately needed. They hit ball-bearing factories, disrupting production of essential components. They struck transportation networks, making it increasingly difficult for Germany to move troops and supplies. The strategic bombing campaign was controversial then and remains debated by historians now, but its impact on German war production and civilian morale was undeniable. And much of that impact was delivered by bombers that had rolled off Henry Ford's assembly line in Michigan. American bomber crews who flew B-24s from Willow Run generally found them to be reliable aircraft. The B-24 wasn't the most beloved bomber. Crews often preferred the B-17 Flying Fortress, which had a better reputation for bringing crews home despite heavy damage. The B-24 was harder to fly, less forgiving of pilot errors, and had some uncomfortable characteristics. But it was reliable mechanically, which reflected the quality of manufacturing at Willow Run despite the speed of production. The bombers held together under combat stress. Their engines ran reliably. Their systems functioned as designed. Ford's emphasis on quality control and standardization paid dividends in combat reliability. A bomber built quickly by inexperienced workers using assembly line methods proved just as reliable, and often more reliable, than craft-built aircraft from traditional manufacturers. The economic efficiency of Willow Run's production was as impressive as the volume. Ford's assembly line methods reduced the man-hours required to build each B-24 from over 300,000 hours using traditional methods to under 18,000 hours at peak efficiency. That's a 16-fold improvement in labor productivity. The cost per bomber also dropped significantly as production volumes increased and manufacturing processes were optimized. The learning curve that Ford had predicted, where each aircraft became easier and cheaper to build than the one before, proved real. By 1944, Willow Run was producing bombers at a cost that was roughly half what traditional aircraft manufacturers charged for comparable aircraft. The American taxpayer got exceptional value from Ford's approach. The social impact of Willow Run extended beyond just manufacturing. The plant became a symbol of American industrial might and democratic values. Here was proof that free people working together could outproduce authoritarian systems. The workers at Willow Run weren't forced laborers or enslaved populations. They were free Americans, many of them women, earning good wages and contributing to victory. The image of Rosie the Riveter, the iconic representation of women in wartime industry, could have been drawn from any of thousands of women working at Willow Run. These women proved that gender was irrelevant to manufacturing capability. They could rivet, wire, assemble, and inspect just as well as men. Many of them found the work empowering and were reluctant to give up their jobs when the war ended and men returned from service. The collaboration between Ford and the government at Willow Run also demonstrated what American industry could accomplish when profit motive and national purpose aligned. Ford was a private contractor, not a government agency. The company made money from the Willow Run contract, though profits were limited by cost-plus contracting arrangements. But the motivation wasn't purely financial. Henry Ford, whatever his faults and controversial views on other matters, genuinely believed in American victory and was determined to contribute whatever his company's capabilities could provide. The urgency and commitment that Ford brought to Willow Run reflected a broader pattern across American industry, where business leaders understood that their factories and expertise were essential war assets. German industrialists, viewing the situation from their perspective, found American production achievements both impressive and depressing. German factories were sophisticated and capable, staffed by skilled workers and managed by competent engineers. But they operated under constraints that American factories didn't face. Allied bombing disrupted production and made planning difficult. Labor shortages became critical as men were conscripted and casualties mounted. Raw materials grew scarce as Allied forces captured or destroyed sources. The German economy, despite frantic efforts to mobilize, never achieved the total mobilization that America managed. German civilians continued to have access to some consumer goods throughout most of the war, while American consumer goods production was largely halted. Perversely, America's more complete economic mobilization proved more sustainable than Germany's partial mobilization. The post-war fate of Willow Run provides an interesting coda to its wartime achievement. When the war ended, bomber production stopped almost immediately. The government no longer needed B-24s, and Ford had no interest in continuing aircraft manufacturing. The plant was sold and eventually converted to other uses. For years, it manufactured automobiles and automotive components. Parts of the facility were demolished as they deteriorated. By the early 2000s, most of the historic plant was gone, replaced by modern development. Preservationists managed to save a small portion of the original structure, which now houses a museum dedicated to Willow Run's history and the broader story of American manufacturing during World War II. It's a modest memorial to an extraordinary achievement. Veterans who served in the European theater, whether as aircrew flying missions over Germany or ground troops fighting their way across Europe, understood that their success depended on support from home. The factories, the farms, the transportation networks, and all the civilians who kept America's war machine running were as essential to victory as the soldiers at the front. Willow Run exemplified this support. Every B-24 that rolled off Ford's assembly line represented not just an aircraft, but the combined effort of thousands of workers, hundreds of suppliers, and an industrial system that functioned with remarkable efficiency under enormous pressure. When those bombers flew over Germany, they carried with them the productivity of American industry and the determination of American workers. German officers who survived the war and later toured American factories, including Willow Run, consistently expressed amazement at what they saw. The scale, the organization, the efficiency, all of it exceeded what they had imagined possible. Some German veterans said that if they had understood American industrial capacity before the war, they would have counseled against any conflict with the United States. The material disparity was simply too great to overcome through tactical skill or fighting spirit. One former Luftwaffe officer, viewing the remains of Willow Run in the 1950s, commented that Germany had lost the war in places like this, in factories far from the battlefield where the real decisions were made. He was right. Wars between industrial nations are decided by production capacity as much as by battlefield performance, and America's production capacity dwarfed Germany's. The lesson of Willow Run resonated particularly strongly with Americans who had lived through the Great Depression. These were people who had seen American industry collapse, who had watched factories close and workers stand in breadlines, who had wondered if American capitalism had failed. The war years proved that American industry hadn't failed. It had simply been underutilized. When given clear objectives and adequate resources, American manufacturing could accomplish things that seemed impossible. Willow Run was evidence that American workers were second to none, that American engineering and organizational skills were world-class, that the economic system that had seemed broken in the 1930s was actually capable of remarkable achievements when properly mobilized. Henry Ford himself became a complicated figure in the story of Willow Run. He was in his late 70s when the plant was built, and his health and mental acuity were declining. Much of the actual work of building and operating Willow Run was done by his son, Edsel Ford, and by professional managers and engineers in the Ford organization. Henry Ford's controversial views on various subjects, including his anti-Semitism and his initial reluctance to support the war effort before Pearl Harbor, complicated his legacy. But whatever his personal failings, the achievement of Willow Run stands as a testament to the industrial principles he had pioneered. The assembly line methods he developed for automobiles proved adaptable to the most complex manufacturing challenges, including building heavy bombers. The workers who built bombers at Willow Run carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. For many, it was the first time they had earned good wages doing skilled work. Women who worked at Willow Run often spoke decades later about the pride they felt in contributing to the war effort, in proving they could do jobs that society had told them were only for men. Some of these women fought to keep working in manufacturing after the war, though most were pushed out as returning veterans reclaimed jobs. The experience of wartime work changed attitudes about women's capabilities and planted seeds for the women's movement that would emerge more fully in later decades. Willow Run and factories like it demonstrated that gender limitations on work were social constructions, not natural barriers. The African American workers at Willow Run also found the experience transformative, though they faced discrimination even while contributing to the war effort. Detroit's auto industry had provided employment for black workers during the Great Migration, when hundreds of thousands of African Americans moved from the South seeking better opportunities in northern industrial cities. Willow Run continued this pattern, employing thousands of black workers in its workforce. They faced segregated facilities and discrimination in housing and services in the communities around the plant. Some white workers resisted working alongside black colleagues, but the urgent need for labor and the moral contradiction of fighting a racist regime abroad while practicing racism at home created pressure for change. The war years advanced the cause of civil rights, and industrial facilities like Willow Run were where many of these battles over equality and dignity were fought on a daily basis. The engineering innovations developed at Willow Run influenced post-war manufacturing across multiple industries. The techniques for managing large-scale assembly operations, the quality control systems, the logistics methods for coordinating thousands of suppliers, the training programs for quickly bringing unskilled workers up to productivity. All of these innovations found applications in peacetime manufacturing. American industrial dominance in the decades after World War II rested partly on lessons learned at facilities like Willow Run. The same organizational and management capabilities that won the war helped American companies dominate global markets in automobiles, appliances, electronics, and countless other products. The B-24 Liberator itself had a mixed legacy. It was produced in larger numbers than any other American military aircraft of World War II, with over 18,000 built by all manufacturers. It served on every front, flying missions in Europe, the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and every other theater where American forces operated. It was versatile, being adapted for bombing, transport, maritime patrol, photo reconnaissance, and other specialized roles. But it never captured public imagination the way the B-17 Flying Fortress did. The B-17 was romanticized in films and books, remembered as the iconic American bomber. The B-24 was respected by those who flew and maintained it, but it was workmanlike rather than glamorous. Perhaps that's fitting. The B-24, and especially the Willow Run B-24s, represented American industrial pragmatism at its best. Good enough, produced in overwhelming quantities, doing the job that needed doing without unnecessary flourishes. For the generations that fought World War II, the generation we now call the Greatest Generation, Willow Run represented something important about American character and capability. It represented the ability to identify a problem, commit resources to solving it, innovate when traditional methods proved inadequate, and execute at scale with excellence. These were people who had survived the Depression and won the largest war in history through a combination of courage, sacrifice, and industrial might. They didn't see themselves as exceptional. They saw themselves as ordinary people who did what needed doing. But their achievements were extraordinary by any measure, and Willow Run stands as one of the most impressive examples of what they accomplished. The contrast between American and German industrial approaches during the war reveals fundamental differences in how the two societies functioned. Germany emphasized technical sophistication and engineering excellence, producing weapons that were often superior in individual performance to Allied equivalents. German tanks were better than American tanks in one-on-one combat. German aircraft often had innovative features that Allied planes lacked. But German industry couldn't produce these sophisticated weapons in sufficient quantities to matter strategically. The emphasis on excellence led to complexity, and complexity limited production. American industry took the opposite approach: design for manufacturability, optimize for production volume, accept adequate performance rather than insisting on the absolute best. The Sherman tank wasn't as good as the Panther, but America built 5 times as many Shermans. The B-24 wasn't as refined as some German bombers, but America built them in numbers that Germany couldn't approach. This difference in industrial philosophy reflected deeper cultural differences. American society had always been comfortable with mass production and standardization. Americans bought Ford Model Ts that were all identical and felt no shame in owning the same car as millions of others. American consumer culture embraced standardized products that were affordable and available to everyone. German culture, by contrast, emphasized craftsmanship and individual quality. German consumers expected products to be well-made and distinctive. This cultural difference translated into military production, with Americans mass-producing adequate weapons and Germans craft-building superior weapons in limited numbers. In a prolonged industrial war, the American approach proved superior. The German intelligence officer who dismissed early reports about Willow Run as propaganda eventually learned he had been wrong. Like many German intelligence failures during the war, this one stemmed from mirror imaging, assuming the enemy thought and operated the way Germany did. German aircraft factories couldn't build bombers at the rate Willow Run achieved, therefore American factories must not be able to either. The reports must be propaganda. This failure of imagination, this inability to conceive that adversaries might have fundamentally different capabilities and approaches, contributed to German strategic miscalculations throughout the war. Germany consistently underestimated American industrial capacity, Soviet resilience, and British determination. These underestimations proved fatal. By late 1944, when Willow Run was operating at peak efficiency, the outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. Allied forces had landed in France and were pushing toward Germany from the west. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, having turned the tide after the disaster at Stalingrad. The skies over Germany belonged to the Allies, with bomber streams flying in daylight and facing diminishing resistance. The Third Reich was collapsing under the weight of combined military pressure and the destruction of its industrial base. Willow Run bombers participated in this final phase, flying missions that hastened Germany's defeat. Each bombing raid made it harder for Germany to continue fighting, destroyed resources that couldn't be replaced, and brought the war's end closer. When victory in Europe was finally achieved in May 1945, Americans celebrated with relief and joy. The war had been won through the courage of servicemen who fought on battlefields around the world, but also through the efforts of civilians who built the weapons, grew the food, provided the medical care, and kept the country functioning under wartime pressures. The men and women of Willow Run were among millions of American civilians whose contributions made victory possible. They had taken farmland and turned it into the world's most productive aircraft factory. They had proven that ordinary Americans with minimal training could build sophisticated weapons when given proper tools, organization, and leadership. They had demonstrated American industrial might in ways that enemies couldn't match and allies gratefully acknowledged. The story of Willow Run deserves to be remembered not just as industrial history, but as human history. It's a story about what free people can accomplish when working toward a common goal. It's about innovation and adaptation, about refusing to accept that something can't be done just because it hasn't been done before. It's about the dignity of work and the pride of contributing to something larger than yourself. The workers who built bombers at Willow Run knew they were making a difference. Every bomber that rolled off their assembly line was another weapon in the arsenal of democracy, another tool to defeat fascism and defend freedom. That knowledge made long shifts in a noisy, demanding factory environment meaningful in ways that few jobs ever are. For Americans of the World War II generation, now in their late 90s or already passed on, Willow Run represents a moment when America was at its best. The country faced an existential threat and responded with unity, determination, and capability. Political differences were set aside in favor of common purpose. Industry and government cooperated rather than fought. Workers and management understood they were on the same team. The entire society mobilized for victory with a completeness that's hard to imagine in our more divided times. Willow Run was one example among many of what that mobilization achieved, but it was perhaps the most dramatic example because the results were so visible and measurable. One bomber every 63 minutes, proof positive that American industry could accomplish anything it set out to do. The German intelligence officer who dismissed the Willow Run reports in 1943 probably never learned the full truth about his error. Perhaps he died in the war. Perhaps he survived and spent years in a prisoner of war camp before returning to a Germany that had been divided and occupied. But whether he personally learned the lesson or not, the lesson was clear to anyone who studied the war objectively. Underestimating American industrial capacity was a fatal mistake. The Ford Motor Company took empty farmland in Michigan and turned it into a factory that produced more heavy bombers than all of Germany's aircraft industry combined. That achievement, repeated across thousands of factories producing every type of war material, made American victory inevitable once the industrial mobilization was complete. Today, when we look at old photographs of Willow Run, we see images that seem almost impossible. The assembly line stretching into the distance, bombers in various stages of completion as far as the eye can see. The crowds of workers, many of them women in work clothes and headscarves, doing jobs that would have been considered unsuitable for women just a few years earlier. The finished bombers lined up outside the factory, dozens of them waiting to be flown away to war. These images document an achievement that changed history and demonstrated what American industry could accomplish when fully mobilized and properly organized. The lesson of Willow Run remains relevant. In times of crisis, free societies with industrial capability and organizational skill can accomplish things that seem impossible. The barriers aren't usually technical or economic. They're usually barriers of imagination, assumptions about what can and can't be done. Henry Ford looked at bomber production and imagined it could be done differently, faster, more efficiently. His company proved he was right. That same spirit of innovation and determination, the refusal to accept conventional wisdom about limitations, has always been at the core of American achievement. Willow Run was one shining example among many, but it deserves to be remembered because it captures something essential about American character at a moment when that character was tested and proved equal to the challenge. The bombers are gone now, long since scrapped or placed in museums. The workers have passed on, their contribution honored by grateful generations who understand that freedom was preserved by their labor. Most of the factory itself has been demolished, replaced by modern development. But the achievement endures in memory and history. Willow Run stands as proof that free people, working together with skill and determination, can accomplish remarkable things. It's a lesson worth remembering, especially in times when America faces challenges that seem daunting. The men and women who built a bomber every 63 minutes would remind us that challenges are overcome not by accepting limitations, but by refusing to believe that anything worthwhile is impossible.